Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 2nd of March 2022. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on the screen, and let us now begin the discussion. So the first article which we have taken for today's discussion appears on page number 6. The Ukraine war, India and a stand of non-alignment. And so this article is written in the context of India's response to the crisis which has emerged between Ukraine and Russia. The author says that New Delhi's present position apart, the only lasting principle in foreign policy is the principle of national interest. And in this context, author posits that it is a very challenging time for India. India is definitely in a difficult position because on one hand, there is a growing relationship with the United States. As is often maintained, India-US relations have never been better. This is true especially in defense sector. Much is also made of the famous Quad, which is essentially an arrangement to contain China. How that helps India, the only one in Quad having a territorial dispute with China, is not clear. And on the other hand, there is Russia, with whom we have a long-standing history of friendship, which is still our principal source of military hardware and which is willing more than other countries to share the technology involved. Russia has also helped us out in the United Nations on many occasions. And so, when these two countries are directly or indirectly involved in a conflict, that of course presents a very difficult situation for India to strike a right balance. And so in this regard, the author says that the government of India has done very well by maintaining a kind of neutral position. And it is a demonstration of the classical Nehruvian policy of non-alignment. Apart from this, a lot of articles have been published in past 10 to 20 days talking about revitalization of this group, non-alignment movement NAM in particular, or the policy of non-alignment in general. Now it is important for us to know these aspects because under GS paper 2, effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interests is a part of your syllabus. How India engages with these world power also becomes a part of your syllabus, and so non-alignment movement demands a special discussion. We have seen NAM has lost its significance in past decade, where the summits have not been concluded regularly. The issues which have been raised in NAM have not gained any global coin, and so definitely there is no hesitation in accepting the fact that NAM as a group and non-alignment as a policy has lost its significance. But is it a time to revive this movement? And so we are going to conduct that discussion by first understanding few of the prelims perspective in this particular case. Then we will talk about the genesis of the NAM, what function it did or what work it conducted while it was relevant, why did it fail, and what is its current relevance. Starting the discussion with non-alignment movement, which was a forum of 120 developing world states not formally aligned with or against any major power bloc. We are going to understand the context very soon, and it was the largest grouping of states worldwide after UN. It originated in 1950s as an effort by some of the countries to avoid the polarized world of the Cold War. First summit conference took place in Belgrade 1961. As you can see, the prominent leaders, their images are given on the screen. And it had two main purposes. No formal alignment with either of the power blocs, and it provided a platform for newly independent developing nations to join together to protect their autonomy and to world peace and prosperity. There were 5 principles that served as the basis of NAM. First, mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, mutual non-aggression. Third, mutual non-interference in domestic affairs. Fourth, equality and mutual benefit. And fifth, peaceful coexistence. Alright, so we will begin the discussion by first understanding the genesis of NAM, or non-alignment movement. And so when you go back to the time when NAM was conceptualized, you know that Cold War was going on, which tended to divide the world into two rival alliances. One headed by United States of America and another one headed by USSR. And it was in this context that non alignment offered the newly decolonized countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America a third option, which was about joining neither of these two rival alliances. And so, just to take a small and a brief detour, the roots of NAM went back to the friendship between three leaders: Yugoslavia's Joseph Broz Tito, India's Jawaharlal Nehru, and Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who held a meeting in 1956. Indonesia's Sukarno and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah strongly supported them. And so these five leaders came to be known as the five founders of NAM. And the first non-aligned summit was held in Belgrade in 1961. And this was the culmination of at least three factors: cooperation among these five countries, growing Cold War tensions and its widening arena, and rapid decolonization, the dramatic entry of many newly decolonized African countries into the international arena. By 1960, there were 16 new African members in the UN. And so as non-alignment movement grew into a popular international movement, countries of various different political systems and interests joined it. And so this made the movement less homogeneous or more heterogeneous, and also made it very difficult to define it in terms of what it stood for. So you cannot really say, or you could not really say, what NAM actually means. So after having gone through the genesis of NAM, let's now quickly look at the work which NAM or non-aligned movement spearheaded for 50 to 60 years. First and foremost, a lot of people confuse NAM or non-alignment with isolationism and neutrality. So the policy of staying away from alliances should not be considered as isolationism or neutrality either. Non-alignment is not about isolationism, because that would mean remaining aloof from the world affairs. So if I want to give you an example of isolationism, the foreign policy of United States of America from American War of Independence in 1787 up to the beginning of the First World War was true isolationism, where USA did not involve itself into any of the world affairs. In comparison, the non-aligned countries, including India, played an active role in mediating between the two rival alliances in the cause of peace and stability. Their strength was based in their unity and stability, and their resolve to remain non-aligned despite the attempt by the two superpowers to bring them into their alliances. So it is clear that the work did not involve to isolate from the global affairs. At the same time, it did not also mean neutrality, because neutrality refers principally to a policy of staying out of war. States practicing neutrality are not required to help end a war. They do not get involved in wars and do not take any position on the appropriateness or morality of a war. However, the NAM states, including India and particularly India, were actually involved in wars for various reasons. They also worked to prevent war between others and tried to end wars that had broken out. As we know that the evil of apartheid was massively prevalent in African countries like South Africa, and it was on the agenda of NAM right from its first conference. During second NAM conference at Cairo, the government of South Africa was warned against the discriminatory practices of apartheid. Then the countries of NAM actively participated and espoused the cause of disarmament. In fact, disarmament along with apartheid has been one of the continuous running themes on the motions and resolutions passed at various NAM summits. Then right from its inception, NAM was in favor of UNSC reforms. It was against the domination of either US or USSR. It wanted the representation of the third world countries to make UNSC more democratic. So overall, if you look and analyze the work of NAM over the period of 50 years, you will see more of a virtue signaling moral high grounds, but not real action on the ground. And that became the reason behind the failure of NAM, because NAM as a group lost practical utility as well as cohesion among its members. And let us understand those in detail now. So slowly and gradually, NAM became a platform for cribbing. It became a platform or a forum where developing nations could blame all their problems on the big powers. The platform for criticism and cribbing would still be fine if NAM would ever have come with a positive agenda for the members or for global community to follow. But till date, NAM has not been able to devise or come up with a positive agenda or a plan of action to counter any of the problems which the world is facing. Slowly and gradually, NAM lost moral authority. It lost moral authority because it became a platform for some of the world's most despicable leaders to preen and posture. So if you just look at the list of the Secretary Generals include Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Mugabe, Hosni Mubarak, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, all these people were famous or rather infamous for committing one of the world's most heinous human right violations. Then, as all of us understand, post dismantling of USSR in 1989, the world became unipolar and gradually it is becoming multipolar. And the basic of non-alignment movement is to avoid siding with any of the two powers which existed in the Cold War. So the very circumstances which initiated or led to the genesis of NAM had changed themselves. So the NAM as a group itself lost much of its relevance. Then, as the time passed on, India, due to its growing economy and complementarity of its economy with USA, grew much closer to it. So the flag bearer of non-alignment movement itself, when it grew closer to USA, much of the steam from NAM was lost. And then finally, it failed to resolve any of the prominent regional tension across the South world or across the developing nations. For example, in the era of Cold War, the tension in South Asia escalated due to regional conflict between India and China, India and Pakistan. NAM failed to avoid these tensions in these regions that further led to nuclearization of the region. So the problems like these arose in other regions as well, and NAM was clearly unable to resolve these bilateral issues. And so, coming to the article which was written by the author today. Does NAM still holds relevance in the current context? And the answer is yes. Not as an organization or as a group which was conceptualized 70 years ago, but as a practical mechanism or as an ideology. And the first and foremost is that India, by not taking any particular side in a crisis of Ukraine and Russia, is kind of still continuing the NAM thread underlying. If India continues to revive a NAM-like group, it will reinforce India's position as a leader of the third world or developing nations. After all, India is still widely perceived as a leader of this world. Thus, India's engagement with NAM will help further in the rise of India's stature as the voice of developing world or global south. Apart from that, NAM has acted as a source of soft power for our country, and India can use its historic ties to bring together the NAM countries. India's strength lies in soft power rather than the hard one. Therefore, NAM cannot be based on current political structure where military and economic power is often used to coerce countries. At the same time, we also know that what kind of behavior unreliable states of America is showing. First, committing itself to the active military role in South Asia and Middle East, USA has rapidly withdrawn itself from these conflict zones, which has made its partner quite worried and anxious. Exactly what is happening with Taiwan after Russia attacked Ukraine. Because now Taiwan is anticipating similar step being followed by China very soon, and they are not sure whether USA is going to come and defend itself. Similarly, India has also taken decisive steps to partner with USA by signing various military agreements and by becoming a member of Quad in its defense against China. But we are still not sure whether USA will follow through its promises when the push comes to shove. At the same time, Ukraine and Russia crisis also demonstrate some kind of a revitalization of Cold War, in which one side will be headed by West led by USA, and on the other side there would be Russia-China axis. When the world is again going through the same circumstances, which are quite similar to what happened in Cold War, wouldn't it be logical step to revive a group which was meant to counter exactly these situations. So the trend of geopolitics demonstrates that the world could be headed towards another Cold War-like situation. NAM could serve multiple objectives like autonomy, multilateralism, and institutional reforms. NAM's total strength, which comprises of more than 120 countries, most of them developing, and also a part of UN General Assembly. So if these countries align themselves, act in unison, they could act as a major pressure group globally. At the same time, current world is a world of multilateralism. Though you can say globalization is facing an existential crisis, it is not possible to return to isolationism. So, in the world of complex interdependence, countries are linked to each other one way or another. With rising threats such as climate change, terrorism, receding multilateralism, the global south and NAM countries find themselves in quite a precarious situation. And so, in that kind of a situation, NAM can become that platform where the developing countries and the countries of global south could come together to increase their collective bargaining power, which then can be utilized to bring about much needed reforms in international institutions. So global institutions such as WTO and UN are facing an existential crisis because only a few nations dictate their function. India, along with NAM platform, can push for reforms in these institutions for a more equal and democratic world order. The next article which we have taken has appeared on page number 10, Doubts over Defense Supplies to India. So with tensions escalating between Russia and the West over Ukraine crisis, India, which has major defense cooperation with Moscow and the West, faces uncertainty over timely deliveries in the near future, in addition to lingering threat of the US sanctions under Countering Americans' Adversary Through Sanctions Act or CAATSA over S-400 deal. Now the relationship between USA and Russia have been deteriorating in past decade. And India, being a major partner of both these countries, has been trying to strike a very thin and fine balance between the relations of these two countries. But now, since Russia has openly attacked Ukraine, it will become extremely difficult for India to strike this kind of balance for a very long time in the future. Now, the extreme step taken by Russia in attacking Ukraine is of course a final nail in the coffin between the relation of US and Russia. But there have been various instances since the breakup of USSR which have made sure that this relationship continuously and gradually keeps on declining. And to be able to analyze the overall spectrum of complications, it is important for us to go through that history in a very brief. Because oftentimes these instances, these events and these issues are casually mentioned while you read the newspaper, and you might not be able to comprehend the full dimension of these issues. Because most of the aspirants have started reading the newspaper in past 1, 2, 3 years, but these events go back 5, 10, 15 years in the history. And so we are going to discuss that in next 10 minutes so that whenever you get any of the references in the past when it comes to US and Russia relation, you already have the requisite knowledge. Let us now begin the discussion. So the United States relationship with Russia is today the worst that it has ever been since 1985. We know how last US President Mr. Trump came into office determined to improve ties with Russia. But what we are seeing in last 1 to 2 years is more and more sanctions being levied by American executives against Russian companies and Russian firms. Then in the last 6 months, we have seen how both of them have expelled each other's diplomats. Not just that, the United States national security strategy declares Russia and China the two top threats to US national security. At the best of times, US and Russia ties are a mixture of cooperation and competition. But today, they are largely quite adversarial to each other. And it has not always been like that, especially since the breakup of USSR. Because after the USSR collapsed, many in the United States assumed that once the Russian had thrown off the shackles of Soviet communism, they would want to join the West and become more like Americans and Europeans, mainly what we call as Global West. After the breakup of USSR, the American government sent political and economic advisors to work with officials and people in the very new private sector in Russia to promote democracy and market. Now, during the time when these advisors worked in Russia, there was a lot of chaos. After all, Russia had just ended a very long communist regime. And so this period saw a lot of chaos, few people getting very rich very quickly, and most of the people were getting poor. Along with that, most of the populace and general perception of the public was that Russia's genuine interests were ignored by the West. And so, as a country, Russia felt quite humiliated because it was felt that Russia's genuine interests were ignored. And this also includes Russia's right to a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet states, meaning that they should not aspire to join NATO or the European Union. But it was increasingly being felt by Russia that America was conspiring with other Western European nations to force more and more breakaway states from USSR to join these organizations, which obviously created a threat perception in Russia. At the same time, you have arrival of a man which cannot be removed from office, Mr. Putin, who not only centralized the overall administration in Russia but also has become increasingly authoritarian, under which Russia has come to define its security perimeter not as the borders of Russian Federation but as the borders of former Soviet Union. You talk to any of the former states of USSR, you are creating a threat for Mr. Putin. And so not only Russia has become increasingly authoritarian, but its global aspirations have increased a lot in past 20 years. Now in the same 20-25 years, there have been two periods when they have cooperated with each other, meaning US and Russia. The immediate post 9/11 period when Russia assisted the United States in first phase of the war in Afghanistan, providing information which it had collected from its decade-long war over there. We know USSR was there in Afghanistan and how it became the last war of USSR, and so they had a lot of information and intelligence related to local people and how they operate, and Russia actively provided that to US. And the second is the cooperation as far as arms control is concerned, especially during 2008 and 12 period between President Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev, when Moscow and Washington cooperated on arms control, along with cooperation continuing on Afghanistan and Iran. And let us now go over to the incidents of last 10 years which have taken place, which have actually deteriorated and soured the relationship between US and Russia, creating problems not just for India but also for many other countries. And so for the first time, drastic deterioration between the US-Russia relation came in 2012. When Putin returned to Kremlin in 2012, there were a lot of protests against him, against the way elections were conducted. And Putin started believing that the United States, especially Foreign Secretary or United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, was behind the demonstrator who was funding and fueling the protest in Russia. As a retaliation, the very next year in 2013, Russian state headed by Putin granted political asylum to Mr. Edward Snowden, the NSA contractor who stole millions of classified documents and fled to Russia via Hong Kong. If you don't know about him, he is a former computer intelligence consultant who leaked highly classified information from the National Security Agency in 2013 when he was an employee and subcontractor of CIA. And his disclosures revealed numerous global surveillance programs, many quite actively run by NSA in cooperation with various other Western countries, and it was a big setback for American agencies. And since then, US and other global agencies want to arrest him, but he is quite safe in Russia. The then president of US, Mr. Obama, directly requested Russian government to return him, but to no avail, and finally Obama cancelled a planned summit with Putin. And so that was the second big instance of deterioration in relationship. And then, following months of popular protests, the pro-Russian Ukrainian president fled to Russia and was replaced by pro-Western government. Shortly thereafter, Russian troops moved in to occupy and annex Crimean Peninsula, which had been a part of Ukraine since 1954, thereby violating the terms of 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, US, Ukraine and UK had pledged to uphold Ukraine's territorial integrity. And during the next few months, Russian-backed separatists and Russian troops wearing no dress moved in to occupy the parts of Donbas region in southeastern Ukraine ousting the legitimate local authorities. Since then, Russia and Ukraine have been fighting a very bloody war in the region in which around 14,000 people have died so far. Responding to this violation of sovereignty, US imposed sanctions on Russia and Russian individuals which were very close to Mr. Putin. After the annexation of Crimea, we had Syrian civil war. And in the Syrian civil war, American side wants to remove the President Bashar al-Assad, and Russians have supported him since then. And now we know what is the outcome. He is still the president of Syria. And Russia's entry into Syrian civil war in 2015 to support the president has also created a lot of tensions. Since then, Washington and Moscow have had to deconflict their air operations in Syria to prevent unanticipated collisions. Since last few years, there have been a lot of protests against the sitting president, Mr. Maduro, which is quite disliked by United States because of his history with communist parties. And so the American government supports the opposition leader who has been continuing with his protests in Venezuela. But Russia has been actively supporting the current regime and has been quite successful as well. And this is a problem because Venezuela lies in South American continent quite close to US, and Russia still has a lot of influence over there, which quite angers US. Then the decisive and a major blow to US-Russia relation was Russia's cyber interference in 2016 US presidential election campaigns. Russia at the same time also tried to penetrate election machines in some states, raising the possibility that it could seek to change the outcome of future elections. And in past 10 years, there have been very good relations between Russia and China. Not only their ties are deepening in sense of economics or economic relations, but also in the terms of their convergence as far as they view the globe together. And now this is a problem. This is a problem because now Mr. Biden has to handle two adversaries at the same time, Russia and China. And the stance of Mr. Biden is now appearing to change because of his strategic thinking, because now he thinks that China is a much bigger and a difficult adversary to handle as compared to Russia. Because after all, Russia might have some geopolitical power, but it is not an economic powerhouse. It does not have financial assets. Whereas if you take into account China, it is the manufacturing hub of the world. It is funding massive infrastructural projects across Asia and Africa. More and more countries of Europe are increasingly moving in its pocket. And so, the main reason behind the change in American stance under new President Mr. Joe Biden is the changing American priorities. And that change in priority was indicated when in March, Mr. Biden called first summit of Quad countries, which includes US, India, Japan and Australia, which decided to boost vaccine production to help other countries. Then at home, the US Congress passed $250 billion tech and manufacturing bill, which would ensure funds for semiconductor research, design and manufacturing. And let's admit it, all of these aspects in which China is current leader, whether your mobile is from Apple or from Oppo, all of it is being manufactured, including the chips, in China. And it is the lead in electronic manufacturing and design which is providing the crucial edge to China in technological world. And so Mr. Biden realizes that now when he's gearing up to focus on China, Russia is quite a distraction, and so you cannot handle two geostrategic rivals or adversaries at the same time, and so you will have to mend ties with one of them. Apart from that, you should realize that America and Russia were the first two countries to come up with quite effective vaccines against COVID-19. Then with advances in technologies, as national governments and international institutions explore different approaches to Arctic region, there needs to be coherence, or there needs to be an agreement on Arctic governance on which both US and Russia have to collaborate actively, because these are the only two major players over there. And then what it appears to most of the political thinkers, that now both America as well as Russia are actively thinking to dismantle more and more number of weapons. At the same time, sanctions against Russia have impacted Russia's economy quite adversely. And so for Russia also, improving ties with US is not such a bad proposition. The next article which we have taken has appeared on page number 14. Chip shortage crimps auto wholesales. So the global semiconductor shortage continued to play spoil sports for the Indian automobile industry, with major manufacturers such as Maruti Suzuki, Hyundai, Toyota, Honda reporting a drop in wholesales for February. However, Tata Motors, Mahindra and Mahindra and MG Motor recorded increase in sales. And this has happened mainly due to shortage of semiconductor and chips. Now, if you look into the GS paper 3 syllabus under technology section, this becomes an important part. The chips and semiconductors have been in short supply since last 2 years, mainly due to the breakdown of the supply chain as a result of COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns across the globe. And chip manufacturing utilizing semiconductor is such a specialized job that there are few companies across the world and only 2 to 3 nations which do this job. It is highly specialized job, and even a manufacturing leader like China is dependent on these 2 to 3 nations for their chips. And so in this regard, it becomes important for us to discuss some of the dimensions related to semiconductor manufacturing. Starting with what is a semiconductor. So a semiconductor is a material that allows electrical conductivity between a conductor and an insulator. Semiconductors are made from pure elements like silicon or germanium or compounds such as gallium arsenide. Sometimes their conductivity is changed through doping, which is a process of adding small amounts of impurities to these pure elements, causing large changes in conductivity of the material. So why do we use semiconductors? We use them because they make the devices more compact, less expensive and more powerful. For instance, mobile phones weighed about 2 pounds, costed around $4,000 and held a charge for only 30 minutes of talk time during their initial phase. However, today an individual can buy a smartphone for 5,000 rupees that would give a one-day charge. And that is a result of semiconductor revolution. But it's just one of the applications. There are multiple applications and hence the importance of semiconductor in manufacturing sector. So you can totally understand how revolutionizing inclusion of semiconductor in manufacturing can be. And so it is very significant for us to invest in semiconductor manufacturing because it is going to provide us economic certainty. For example, the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns impacted the supply of chips to India, and automobile manufacturers like Mahindra and Tata Group were compelled to reduce their production due to this shortage. Then it is going to help us in economic development because semiconductors right now are the building blocks of technology. Indigenous manufacturing of chips will build its smartphone assembly industry and strengthen its electronic supply chain. This will create numerous employment opportunities for Indian youth. At the same time, indigenous capacity would attract local taxes and boost the export potential. And further, India would be required to import fewer semiconductor chips, which would decrease its import bill. At the same time, indigenous manufacturing of chip and semiconductors is extremely important to meet the rising demand for these chips because according to experts estimate around 50 crore people will join the internet in next decade, thereby demanding more phones and laptops. At the same time, work from home culture warrants an enhanced demand for servers, internet connectivity and cloud usage. Apart from this, it also has geopolitical benefits driven by data and digital revolution. Increasing self-sufficiency of India will decrease its reliance on Chinese chip imports, especially during hard times like recent Galwan Valley border clash. And it will also enhance the security because chips made locally will be designated as trusted sources and can be used in products ranging from CCTV cameras to 5G equipment. This would improve the national cybersecurity profile. So what is the current position when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing? So globally, the entire value chain is an interdependence between a handful of countries like USA, Taiwan, Japan, China, and some European nations. So India has done well in design and verification for the semiconductor industry because most of the global semiconductor companies are having an R&D footprint in our country. However, 100% of our chips, memory, and display are imported into the country. In 2020, India spent around $15 billion on electronic imports, with 37% coming from China. So, although India has two fabrication units, Sitar, a unit of Defense Research and Development Organization DRDO, and a semiconductor laboratory in Chandigarh. These build silicon chips for strategic purposes like defense, space, and they are not available for commercial uses. So, what are the initiatives which have been taken to promote indigenous semiconductor capacity? The first and foremost, National Policy on Electronics 2019, which envisioned positioning India as a global hub for electronic system design and manufacturing, which is acronymed as ESDM sector. It also aimed to encourage the development of core components, including chipsets. Then, Scheme for Promotion of Manufacturing of Electronic Components and Semiconductor, or SPECS, where the government will provide a financial incentive of 25% on capital expenditure for a list of products that constitute the supply chain or electronic products. This includes products such as electronic component semiconductors and specialized sub-assemblies. India would be offering more than $1 billion in cash to each semiconductor company that sets up manufacturing units in country. Then we have Modified Electronic Manufacturing Clusters, EMC 2.0 scheme, under which the government will provide support for the setting up of EMCs and common facility centers. Then, government has also come up with production linked incentive scheme, under which the government will provide an incentive of 4 to 6% on goods manufactured in India and covered under target segments to eligible companies for a period of 5 years. Then government has allowed 100% FDI under the automatic route in ESDM sector. At the same time, it is also pertinent to note the challenges in front of India when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing. And there are 5 major challenges. First, high cost of establishment. As per government estimate, it would cost roughly $5 to $7 billion to set up a chip fabrication unit in India. Then, we already have very low ease of doing business, on which Government of India is taking a lot of steps, but to no avail. The process of establishing an indigenous semiconductor facility requires clearances and approvals from multiple government departments. Then we have a big technological constraint. The indigenous manufacturing of semiconductor requires the use of high-end technologies. These technologies are licensed from patent holders at a very high price. Then when we talk about structural constraint, FDI in electronic is less than 1% of the total FDI inflows because of the dearth of skilled labor, delays in land acquisition, and the uncertain tax regime. Then the last factor of unstable power supply is one of the very important challenges which is facing the ESDM sector in our country. The smooth production of semiconductor requires the availability of an uninterrupted 24/7 power supply. So if India wants to become a major player in semiconductor and chip manufacturing, these are the 5 areas where it should work upon. So what are the suggestions or the way forward which we can highlight for the government? First, the government should provide adequate funding to augment the research and development potential of technical institutes. For instance, IIT Madras developed a microprocessor named Moshik with funding support from Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, or METI. Then the proposed sovereign patent fund under National Policy on Electronics should be established immediately. It is a wholly or partly government-backed entity that aims to bolster domestic business through the acquisition and licensing of patent technology. Then, the manufacturer need to be given an assurance of minimum domestic procurement by the government and the private sector. The focus should be on manufacturing economical and technically viable options like 28 nanometer chips. The government should also support businesses in the acquisition of semiconductor manufacturing units in other countries. This is easier than setting up a domestic facility and can be done swiftly for ensuring a continuous supply of chips. So you can understand that chip making and semiconductor industry is a very strategic and crucial sector when it comes to strategic autonomy of our country, when it comes to overall economic development of our country, when it comes to employing a lot of people in the manufacturing sector in our country. And so in this regard, this discussion will help you not only in the prelims sector where we have talked about various schemes and basics of semiconductor, but also for the mains examination where we have talked about the challenges and the way forward. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The next article which we have taken for discussion appears on text and context page. The history of Kuki insurgency. So recently, Union Home Minister promised ending Kuki insurgency problem within 5 years in the wake of ongoing assembly elections in the state. And so, if you remember, we have already done a very extensive discussion on Naga insurgency. Although this problem is nowhere close to that one, but still, it is important for us to understand who Kukis are after all. So the Kukis are ethnic group including multiple tribes originally inhabiting the northeastern states of India such as Manipur, Mizoram, Assam, parts of Myanmar and Sylhet district and Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh. In Manipur, various Kuki tribes living mainly in hills currently make up 30% of the total population of the state. The rest of the population of Manipur is made up of mainly two ethnic groups, Meiteis or non-tribal Vaishnavite Hindus who predominantly inhabit the valley region and Naga tribes historically at loggerheads with Kukis also living in the hilly areas of the state. So what are the main demands of the insurgency or what is the reason behind this insurgency? And there are two main reasons. First is demand for a separate state. Demand for self-determination solely for groups belonging to their ethnic fabric, meaning the dream to form Kuki land. Then, inter-community conflicts between Kukis and Nagas, both of which reside in hill tracts of Manipur over land, trade and cultural identity. As a result, the demand has come to the formulation of an independent district, Kuki Land Territorial Council within the purview of Indian Constitution, modeled on the basis of Bodoland Territorial Council which was formed under the provisions of the 6th schedule. Let us know in the comment section what you understand by the provision of 6th schedule and which are the states in which it is applicable. So as a result, in 2008, the groups entered a tripartite agreement with the state government of Manipur and the central government to temporarily suspend their operations and give political dialogue a chance. However, the suspension agreement has been extended by the government almost every year since 2008 by successive governments at the center. Kukis are dissatisfied with the pace of dialogue and also feel ignored, as the government has been actively holding Naga peace talks with main Naga insurgent outfit NSC and IM, which demands the formation of Greater Nagaland. So in this regard, it is important for us to discuss what are the steps which have been taken by the government to deal with insurgency in Northeast region. Starting with the imposition of UPSPA or special powers under UPSPA or Armed Forces Special Powers Act were given to armed forces to deal with insurgency in the region. Then the provisions of Inner Line Permit, which is a restriction imposed on outsiders from visiting certain districts in Mizoram, Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh. The purpose is to maintain the original identity of indigenous people. Then Northeast Special Infrastructure Development Scheme to improve infrastructure in the region. Then Hill Area Development Program for Northeast to minimize the gap between hill and valley district of states in terms of infrastructure, quality of roads, health, education. This will reduce the sense of disenchantment of hilly tribes. Then finally, non-lapsable central pool of resources. It is an accrual of unspent balance of mandatory 10% budgetary allocation for the Northeast region. This pool of resources would be used to fund priority projects of Northeast region. A cautionary tale. India must heed the warning of IPCC report and shore up adaptation measures. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the largest international consortium of scientists analyzing and reviewing the evidence on the present and future man-made impacts of climate change, has a message that is predictably dire. The panel's second working group has come up with its report. The first working group has already been discussed in the DNS, and so oftentimes students get confused as to what these working groups are. IPCC has three working groups. Working Group 1, which aims at assessing the physical scientific basis of climate system and climate change. Working Group 2, which assesses the vulnerability of socio-economic and natural systems to climate change, negative and positive impacts. And Working Group 3, which assesses the options for mitigating climate change through limiting or preventing greenhouse gas emissions. And so in the DNS, we have already discussed the report of Working Group 1,
when it was released in the month of August and September. Now the report of Working Group 2 has come, where more or less the data, the trends are same as that of Working Group 1. So what we are going to do is that first we are going to look at the things which are different, the observations which were not there in the Working Group 1 report, and then we will listen to the discussion which was a part of DNS in the month of August. Starting with the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The world faces unavoidable multiple climate hazards over the next 2 decades with global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Then the report points out that the rise in weather and climate extremes had led to some irreversible impacts. Then report says that the impacts of global warming are such and irreversible in such a manner that it has pushed it beyond the capacity of natural and human systems to adapt. So adaptation is becoming increasingly difficult due to global warming. Most of the targets that countries have set for themselves are too far in future to have an impact in the short term at meaningfully reducing the climate impact. So this is a kind of a sly on the commitments made by countries in terms of climate action. Then there is a keyword wet bulb temperature which has been used in the report, which is an index of the impact of heat and humidity combined and its impact on health. Lucknow and Patna, according to the report, were among the cities predicted to reach wet bulb temperatures of 35 degrees Celsius if emissions continued to rise, while Bhubaneswar, Chennai, Mumbai, Indore and Ahmedabad are at risk of reaching wet bulb temperatures of 32 to 34 degrees Celsius with continued emissions. Global sea levels will likely rise 44 to 76 centimeters this century if government meets their current emission cutting pledges. But with higher emissions, and if ice sheets collapse more quickly than expected, sea levels could rise as much as 2 meters this century and 5 meters by 2150. India is one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of population that will be affected by sea level rise. By the middle of the century, around 35 million of its people could face annual coastal flooding, with 45 to 50 million at risk by the end of the century if emissions are high. So according to the article, although the experience show that partisan economic calculation trump climate considerations, but India must shore up its adaptation measures and urgently move to secure the future of its most and many vulnerable who have the most to lose. So these are the observations which were not there in the report of Working Group 1, and let us now quickly revise the observations of the report of Working Group 1 of IPCC. Sixth Assessment Report. The IPCC, which provides regular assessments of scientific basis of climate change, its impact and future risks, and options for adaptation and mitigation. The IPCC reports are also a key input into international climate change negotiations. It was created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP. For preparing the reports, IPCC does not conduct its own research. It is very important, but rather it relies on the researches being done across the world by various scientists and agencies. And so it basically compiles the data which is already being created, which is already being published in the journals. So what does the sixth assessment report talks about? The sixth report shows that there is unambiguous and unequivocal evidence that human influence has warmed the climate. The fact that human influence has caused the global warming and hence the climate change is undeniable. There are widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere and biosphere that have occurred and are occurring, and they are going to occur for some time. Recent changes across the climate system are unprecedented over many thousands of years. So the kind of climate change that we are observing has not taken place in last many thousand years. So all across the world, the extremities of the climate and the weather which we are observing is clear-cut result of global warming. Global surface temperature is now higher by around 1.07 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial level. And this temperature will continue to increase until at least the mid-century under all emission scenario considered. So even if we include the commitments made across the world under Paris Climate Deal, then also the temperature will still continue to rise. And so the global warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless and until deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other GHGs are done in the coming decades. Report also notes that the carbon dioxide has been and will continue to be the dominant cause of global warming under all GHG emission scenarios. So, two important takeaways: the temperature has risen and will continue to rise, and we are going to breach the commitments made under Paris Climate Deal. And carbon dioxide is a major factor and will continue to remain the major factor. What about the region in which we lie, the region of our interest? That is the South Asian region. So the report says that the South and Southeast Asian monsoon has weakened in second half of the 20th century, and the dominant cause of this decreased precipitation is anthropogenic aerosol forcing. Both annual and summer monsoon precipitation will increase during the 21st century with enhanced interannual variability, and so we need to be prepared for higher incidence of flooding going forward. So this is the increased frequency and intensity of disasters that we talk about. Heat waves and humid heat stress will be more intense and frequent during the 21st century. So these are the three takeaways for South Asian region. But what about the mountainous regions? So first and foremost, the report says that the freezing level height in mountain areas is projected to rise and will alter snow and ice conditions. So this is no surprise. We have observed the increment in the snow line in our Himalayan region as well. Then warming has occurred in Himalayas, Alps and Central Andes and has increased with altitude. So as we go higher in mountains, the warming also increases, and that is known as elevation dependent warming. And this has the potential to alter the snow line much more rapidly than other factors. Then mountain glaciers are retreating very rapidly. Of course, there are few exceptions, but majority of glaciers are retreating across the world. And so in the coming future, the glaciers will continue to lose mass at least for several decades, even if global temperatures are stabilized. The global warming induced earlier onset of spring snow melt and increased melting of glaciers have contributed to seasonal changes in stream flow in low elevation mountain catchments. So specifically among mountains, what is the impact on Himalayas? Snow cover has reduced since 21st century and glaciers have thinned, retreated and lost mass. Karakoram glaciers have either slightly gained mass or are in an approximate balanced state. So these are the exceptions when we talked about the mountains. Snow-covered areas and snow volumes will decrease during the 21st century. Snow line elevations will rise. Glacier mass is likely to decline with greater mass loss in higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios, and rising temperature and precipitation can increase the occurrence of glacial lake outburst floods and landslides over moraine-dammed lakes. And this is what has happened in Uttarakhand early this year. Global warming directly linked with increased instances of disasters. Then what about oceans? Marine heat wave will increase in frequency in 21st century. Warming will decrease ocean oxygen concentrations and deoxygenation will persist over coming centuries. Mean sea level is projected to rise over 21st century due to continuing deep ocean heat uptake and mass loss from ice sheets. Majority of coastal locations have a regional sea level rise within plus minus 20% of the projected global mean sea level change. Ocean acidification has increased globally in the past decade. As far as Indian Ocean is concerned, it has warmed faster than the global average. Now, as far as polar regions are concerned, annual mean surface temperatures and precipitation will continue to increase in both polar regions. Mean precipitation and precipitation intensity will increase in the polar regions. Glaciers have lost mass in all polar regions and will continue to lose mass in coming decades. And that is even when the global temperatures are stabilized. Both major ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctic, have been losing mass since at least 1990s, with pace accelerating in past 10 years. Now, as far as urban areas are concerned, they are set to turn warmer than their surrounding rural areas due to urban heat island effect. Urbanization is clearly altering the water cycle. It is generating increased precipitation over the downwind of the cities. Rapid urbanization is also inducing phenomena such as urban dryness island, which refers to conditions where lower humidity values are observed in cities relative to more rural conditions, and to slower wind speed compared to adjacent suburbs and countryside. Warmer climate is expected to increase surface ozone over polluted regions, and climate change will be more pronounced in extreme air pollution episodes in heavily polluted environments. As far as coastal cities are concerned, both sea levels and air temperature will rise in coastal settlements, and combination of extreme sea level increased by both sea level rise and storm surge and rainfall river flow will actually increase the probability of flooding in the cities which are situated along the coast. So these are the important takeaways from the 6th assessment report, and this is the first report. Now the terms which have been used in this particular discussion will be discussed later on as and when they appear in the newspaper. For example, urban heat island impact, elevation dependent warming, heat waves, but they have also been discussed in our DNS in last 1 year. But it is important from the perspective of prelims examination to keep at least these points in mind because they can be put as an option in one of the questions. Let us now move on to the last discussion.